We can get started. And I am on both here and there. Okay, all right, everyone. Happy New Year, 2024. I think a lot of us are happy to see 2023 behind us. And we're doing today, we can go to our next slide. We're doing what really we would call a boutique seminar today, okay? We do a lot of different webinars, and I'm going to show a few of them that we do, but this is probably the most boutique of all of them. Rod, I still see me. There's a little bit of delay. Yeah, okay. So we've got one of those QR codes there. If there's any webinar here that catches your interest, just stick your phone up and you can grab and register for it. The big one we're doing this year is on apartment development, and it's 11 sessions, and it's we call it our apartment development masterclass. And interestingly enough, that more than half the people who signed up for it so far are intergenerational families, and it's parents putting their children in this program so they can learn about development. I mean, we didn't tie it to this webinar. It's just interesting that a number of the attendees there are second and third generation younger people who want to learn the business. And I think the other half, or a good part of it, is also new employees in development companies that are saying we want to teach our staff, bring up the speed on apartment development quickly. And so we run a number of webinars. This is one of them, usually on topics that people aren't talking about. Okay, so we run one, and I'm going to refer to it on how to invest your family's equity in Canada and the US in apartment development. We'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. We're also now doing a lot of work with in the home building industry with something called the self-funding house. And we've recognized that to solve the affordability crisis and to solve the rental housing crisis, people building basement apartments or backyard apartments or garage apartments can quickly create low-cost rental supply, but can also make home ownership more affordable, because now the rent that you get from that apartment helps you pay your mortgage. So it's a book it's a different program, but if you find yourself interested in either how do my children buy a home or how do we create affordable housing quickly without the government, this concept of the self-funding house would be interesting for you. And this is particularly for renovators to go into single-family homes and do it. We think that also the next seminar, Solving and Profiting from Canada's Housing Crisis, we mean solving, but if no one's going to profit from it, no one's going to solve it. Okay, so there's a number of opportunities that are coming, mainly on the land development side, the financing, and the construction side of the business of building affordable housing. Our belief, and it's happening, there are a lot of grants and programs coming in place that will make what was a business that didn't work into one that will work going forward. Okay, right, next slide. We also do a lot of work in Alberta. We've got a number of buildings for sale. We're doing a separate session on April 17th with people from Calgary, the planning department, developers. We've got some actual buildings for sale there that we talk about. We think Alberta is probably the best apartment market in the country right now. While we might feel like our market's going down, they feel like theirs is going up. And then related to that, in a lot of parts of Canada and North America, there are good developers who need to raise more money because construction costs have gone up and interest have gone up so significantly that we are recapitalizing new apartment deals. We're going to talk about a little bit later on the intergenerational family section. And then office conversions, you hear a lot about it. It is a very boutique business, but a number of office conversions are occurring, and probably more are going to occur because of just the work from home. And also you've got functionally obsolescent office buildings, Class B and Class C, and nobody wants those, so they may be conversions to rental or condo opportunities. We're doing a how-to session on that. That's a 3-hour session and so on. This is done in Zoom meetings, so we want everybody to maintain their anonymity here. But if you have a question that you want to ask, pop it in here, and we'll do our best to answer it at the end of the session. Okay. All right. Okay. So with those common answers, let's get started here. So here's the agenda for today. You can read this on your own. And Rod, let's just get started. We'll go on to the next slide. So, this is what an intergenerational family could look like. I mean, this is maybe why you're here right now, because you are one of the descendants, Gen 1, you could be probably not Gen 1, but you're Gen 2 or Gen 3. And maybe your family owns a complex portfolio of product. And this is a real family we're talking about here, where there was the grandfather, the father, the kids, he had partners, right? And they had small pieces of the deal, and there were different asset classes. So when we were just explaining it to people, we found it best just to draw the diagram here. And we have dealt with companies that are much more complicated than this. I mean, we're dealing with sometimes families that have 100 different partnerships and 100 different assets and multiple partners in one, and some of the partners in another, and a completely different group in another, and things like that. And then all of a sudden, as you get down the generations, people don't know each other, and then they want to separate, and there's not a good way to separate. That's part of the work that we do. Okay, Rod, next slide. So you may belong to a situation like this. Let's just we're apartment guys. Well, what we're talking about here typically relates to real estate, but our expertise is in apartments. I think that the last few years has been tough on business, certainly tough on development, but anybody who was running an apartment portfolio prior to COVID, 2018, 2019, you were running the business. All of a sudden, it got a lot harder. Costs started going up. Your turnover went down. So your revenue kind of stayed flat, but your costs went up. And so your cash flow went down, right? And then you got the refinance. Again, that was another hit to cash flow. So I think it's been difficult for all businesses, but also difficult for intergenerational families, who own apartments. Okay, next slide. I think there's a slight okay. So this is interesting chart. So we put this on my LinkedIn every month. We track the number of apartment transactions across Canada, and you can see that that black line is clearly going down. Okay, so from a high, in October of 2021, 22, we had like 70, 80 sales, and that dropped down to maybe 20 sales right now. The end of the end of the year, it spiked up 37 and 24. So maybe the market is thawing out a little bit, but look, we're apartment brokers. This is what we do. There's a disconnect between the buyer and the seller right now, and that's caused because of rising interest rates, right? But overall, the transaction level has been going down consistently for the last, let's say, 3 years, and maybe a slight uptick here, but I don't know if that's just maybe an end of year closings happening and things like that. Okay, right? Slide. So, everything the value of your apartment portfolio is determined by the cap rate. Fair enough? And so let's just talk here about what drives real estate value or apartment value. Okay. And it's the same if you're in a different asset class, the line is just in a different place, but the trend is about the same. So this is going right back to the year 2000. And the yellow line is the buyer IRR target. So what return does the buyer want? Okay, an internal rate of return. And you can see that overall the rate's been going down, meaning buyers expect to pay more and get less profit from a deal. That's what it means, right? And then the green line, the term you're all familiar with, is the cap rate, right? What is the cap rate of this is US data, by the way. So it's the trend I want you to look at, not the actual number, because the cap rate's different in Canada versus Kansas, or Alberta versus Halifax or Montreal or Vancouver, right? But it's the relationship and the trend I want you to look at. You can see that buyer IRR targets and cap rates track each other almost 100%. They're just a different way of measuring the same thing, return. It's two sides of the same coin. Now, the blue line is the 10-year US Treasury, which is a measure of interest rates, okay? And you can see that, interest rates were steadily going down till about 2021, and then all of a sudden, here's where we got in trouble, right? Interest rates started rising, and they were at a real low in 2020, and then they started peaking in 2023, right? And the projection here is that they're going to go down. This chart comes from Witten and Associates, Ron Witten, and who puts this out, really smart guy, and he's kind of thought this through logically, and this is his projection, and his projection, I think, is as good as anybody that I would know, right? And so if you follow what's happening is that, and then the spread between the green line and the blue line, which is interest rates, is the interesting spread. And that's represented, Rod, just move the cursor by the gray chart, by the gray bar chart. So you can see that the spread between interest rate and cap rates is not consistent. Okay, it's very, very inconsistent. Okay, and I would say that when the spread between the interest rate and the cap rate is high, meaning that gray bar is high, buyers want to buy and sellers want to sell. Fair enough, because the interest rate spread is really your profitability. But when that time period, but when that period of time which you are in right now, where the interest rate and the cap rate are very close to each other, there's no meat left on the bone here, right? And so there's the buyer and the seller. The buyer says, "Hey, I've got no cash to pay you because interest rates are so high," and the seller saying, "Well, I remember back a few years ago my property's worth this," and so because there's that disconnect, you're not getting transaction occur. There's basically a difference between buy and sell price, and that's driven by the fact that interest rates are now higher. So if we project where interest rates go, and it's generally believed interest rates are going to go down, and if cap rates stay the same, then that spread is going to be higher. You can see the spread in 24 and 25, right? And maybe then apartment transactions start coming back. But up until interest rates drop or people accept there's a new paradigm, which they're less likely to do, and nobody in the apartment business is in real trouble where they've got to sell their apartments, they're just going to say, we'll just hang on to them, right? And so that's kind of where the apartment market is right now. If you're having to guess, most people guess interest rates are going to go down, which is generally good news for cap rates. Cap rates should go down as well. Cap rates haven't gone up that much just because there aren't that many transactions, right? And so maybe what I'm saying is there might be more liquidity in the market for all asset classes because it's all interest rate driven. And if you are a family that was considering a sale, then today may not be the best time, but maybe better times are coming. Okay, Rod, next slide. So what's good? Well, apartments in general are just good, right? They're stable. If we go into recession, nobody's building's going to be half empty or anything like that. Rents are strong. Vacancies are low. Okay, prices are holding. Transactions are low. Also, because turnover is low, and most of you have older rent control buildings, people aren't moving, and therefore you're not able to raise the rent. But your operating costs are going up. So that's going to have an impact on your cash flow. And that may be not a good thing for families who are relying on their cash flow to live on. And all of a sudden, that cash flow goes down. Even if I'm telling you the apartment building value hasn't gone down, you're equity rich, but you may be cash poor. Okay. And so there's no bargains out there. I mean, everyone calls me and says, Derek, I've got dry powder. I've got $100 million in the bank, which a lot of people do. There really are no bargains out there for apartment buyers in this market because there are no motivated sellers. Okay, Rob? So that's what's good. The trends for the next year, I think, are maybe lenders are going to be a little more impatient, a little less extend and pretend, which is what they're doing right now. There might be more forbearance, and there might be more out of court settlements and things like that because lenders have some bad loans on the books, mostly in other asset classes, some apartments, some new construction, in our sector. And I also think that for 2024, you're going to see more office conversions, and I think you're going to see more affordable housing programs. And we think that's a big opportunity for private equity sitting on the sidelines is to get into the affordable housing development business. Not a topic for today, but we talk a lot about that, if that interests you. Okay. All right. So next slide. Let's talk about intergenerational families, right? The first thing that you need to think about is the income tax consequences of long-term real estate ownership. So someone in your family built these apartments a couple of 30, 40 years ago, right? Well, when they built them, they cost a lot less. They've gone up in value completely. They're fully depreciated. So you've got a recapture, which isn't your biggest tax bill, but then you've also got a capital gain, and that capital gain tax is expensive. It's 20, let's call it 25, 26, 27% of all the money you get. Then plus there's some recapture, so that number takes it up higher to over 30%. And then there's all kinds of complications here. If some of the family live in America and hasn't been structured right, there can be a double taxation. The family could have borrowed money against the asset. Now that money's got to be repaid. and out of the proceeds and things like that. So I would say that you need, Rod, next slide. I think that if you're a family in the real estate business, don't buy this book. Okay, don't buy this book. This is a book written by kooky people, but look who wrote the foreword. Okay, he happens to be the leader of the official opposition in Canada, Jagmeet Singh, and really this is I would call this book sort of a war on Canada's wealthy. Okay, and Jagmeet is proposing a wealth tax. He's proposing the elimination of the capital gains exemption, and just really, I don't think anybody believes, especially after going through COVID, that our tax rate is going to go down. Governments have spent money like crazy. That money has to be found somewhere. And a lot of people say tax the rich. Okay. And you may not feel rich, but there may be a lot of value in your portfolio. And something like a wealth tax every year to pay would be insane how you'd administer that. And then there's also that if you do sell, then the capital gains exemption could be changed. A lot of people think that's the easiest thing to change politically, and it would generate some money, right? So whatever you're thinking about doing for your family, the single largest cost you're going to face is taxation. And we have a series of advisors that we bring our clients to. When we list a building, the first thing we say to a client is, oh, we'll start working on getting the package together. But the first thing you need to do is we need to meet with your accountants, your lawyers, and the best tax advisors that we can find to see how we structure this deal efficiently. And that is the biggest chunk of your $100 million you're going to get on selling. 25, 30, 40 million of that could go to taxes, right? And your job is to structure it so that you don't pay as much tax. And there's some simple things to do. There's some complicated things to do. Just knowing that that is there. And our guess, and probably yours, everybody's guess, is that taxes are going up in the future. Okay, Rod, I'm just gonna try and get in focus here by putting my hand here. Do you see me out of focus?
Yeah, you're looking better now.
Am I? Maybe I look better out of focus. Okay, all right. Strategic thinking. So you say, well, as a family grows, you can't expect everybody to be involved or choose to be involved in the business. And that's just realistic. And oftentimes, generation, I spent my entire life working for intergenerational families. Gen 1 thinks everybody wants to be in the business, and they don't, right? So what do you do? Well, I think you do all that you can to engage Gen 3 in the business so that they, maybe educate them in real estate. For example, taking the CCIM program, I think would be very worthwhile for any Gen 1 or Gen 2 wanting Gen 3 to be in the business. Learn the business at the mathematical and academic level, right? Encourage them to get work experience in the business outside of your company and inside your company. But it could also mean, and this is where we've seen some success with intergenerational families, it could also mean opening up a different division in your company. So for example, one of our clients, a significant developer, has several children, and one of the kids took a real interest in environmental buildings, green buildings, energy efficiency, and things like that. And that child has brought new thinking to the grandfather and the father. And all of a sudden now their buildings are more energy efficient and their business is better, and the child is now in the business because that was what they were interested in doing. I mean, and you can say it bluntly, that oftentimes Generation 3 has never had to worry about grocery money. Gen 1 worried about grocery money because they went from poor to rich in a lifetime. Gen 2, they had money, typically lived very frugally. Gen 3 typically hasn't. So you've got to find what interests them. They don't need a job per se. You might create a job based on what their needs are because you want them in the business, right? Another example is a lot of families have money. They have essentially what is a family office. So they've been collecting cash, they have investments and things like that. They'd like to invest those investments sometimes in real estate. Well, there's nothing wrong to create a family office with an investment arm, and maybe one of the Gen 2 or Gen 3 or some of the Gen 2 or Gen 3 children become the bankers for the business, right? So now you've got family money and things like that being invested properly, right? Okay, right, next slide. So, we're thinking, where should money go? So if you have cash in the bank or you're going to have a liquidity event, how do you involve Gen 2 and Gen 3? And mainly I'm talking about Gen 3 here, I think. Where should the money go? Well, typically right now, where money is going is it's going into short-term GICs, right? Interest rates are 4%, 5% with zero risk. Well, there's some risk because inflation could be eating at it and things like that. But assuming things that return to normal, whether they do or not, we don't know. And interest rates level out, then what do you do with that money when if interest rates go back down, then your returns go to, measly, 1 or 2 or 3%, 50% of that is taxed, and things like that. So where should money go? Well, why don't you take Gen 3, who's sometimes pretty educated, right? They've got business degrees and backgrounds and things like that, and start thinking about creating an entity inside your company for Gen 3 to invest in. And then all of a sudden, I think they're going to be very interested in the core business because the core business is producing the cash for them to invest, right? Not everyone can do that. Not everyone can form a green part of their company. But what I'm saying is, in a nutshell, don't assume Gen 3 wants to be in your business, but doesn't mean they can't be in your business. You should be seeing what their love, their desire, and their skill is, and maybe creating a position for them to be in the business. And then they will learn to love the business, grow in the business, or start their own business. And oftentimes you see Gen 3 or Gen 2 jumping into a similar real estate business, and because they want to be in their own business, they want to create their own mark. Just having the family wealth isn't enough for them. Okay, Rod, next slide. So where should money go is really what I'm talking about here. We think one place to put money is in new apartment construction deals that are underway. So there's some very good developers who started deals. They're under construction. They are not over leveraged, but construction costs have gone up. They need more cash, and they've got lots of equity, and they may sell some of that equity, let you participate in the deal, or you participate with them, and you will get developer type returns. So you'll get, active returns for a passive investment. We don't think this opportunity is going to last forever, but we think right now one of the best deals we see is recapitalizing new apartment construction in both Canada and the US. Okay, just as an example of what could a Gen 2 or a Gen 3 person do in a company, right? So back. So we look at the next slide, which is the capital stack. So what I'm saying is that typically, if you're building an apartment building, the way it used to be was 75% construction loan, 15% mezzanine financing, and 10% was equity, right? And sometimes that equity was split into two groups, right? Well, today, you might not be able to get that 15% mezzanine and 75% construction loan. Your equity piece needs to be larger. In the middle of the deal, your equity piece got larger. So we think that there's an opportunity to restructure and recapitalize new apartment construction in both Canada and the US, but it's very much driven by the deal, by the developer and things like that, right? For developers over his skis and way over leverage, we don't think you should be the one riding in, to save them. That developer could go under, and regrettably some will because of the interest rate rise. Okay, all right. So next slide. So you come from this intergenerational family, right? And what are the traits of that intergenerational family? Well, let me just generically describe Gen 1. So Gen 1 is usually a very small group, right? And the group of people, if they're partners, brothers and sisters and things like that, they're probably pretty close to each other. And the founders were visionaries. They were exceptionally hard workers. Many were Holocaust survivors. But they basically, if they had a problem with their partners, with anybody, they got in a room and they worked it out, and they were risk takers. They were probably big risk takers, okay? And you can be a big risk taker when you have nothing. But now, when later generations have something, it's hard to take that same risk again. And different people in the family have different risk tolerances. So it went from maybe two brothers or a group of 2, 3, 4 people, partners who had nothing, scraped together what they had, started taking risk, and they could take risk even as their business grew. But the other generations now have tens of millions of dollars, oftentimes hundreds of millions of dollars. They don't have that. So that Gen 1 battled through wins and losses together, and they went from poor to rich in one generation. Now, they were an amazing group of people, right? And they, when they did this, I don't think any of these Gen 1s ever thought their businesses would be this big. So a $10 million building 40 years ago is now worth, $100 million. I think they just assumed that the next generation would work things out the way that they did. Well, that's not what happens oftentimes, right? So that's the description of Gen 1. Because I often wonder, how did these brilliant people, okay, sometimes leave such a mess behind? Well, first of all, they just assumed people would solve it the way they did, and they couldn't have projected that $10 million building would be worth $100 million. And by now, that $10 million building got paid off, right? So Gen 1 now from the 50s and 60s is very old or dead, right? And Gen 2 then took over. Let me describe Gen 2 now. So Gen 2 is a relatively small group, relatively close families, maybe not intimate, but they absolutely knew each other, right? Many worked in the business and some didn't. And it could be, two brothers, and then there was maybe like 2 kids each or 3 kids each. So we were talking about going from, small group of, let's say, under 5 to a group to maybe under 10 or something like that. But Gen 2 leaders, they had a hard job because oftentimes they were under the microscope of Gen 1. So Gen 1 was still around, getting older, and they never ever released the reins to Gen 2. Gen 2 was second guessed, and they had a lack of authority and independence from Gen 1. But Gen 2 kept the family business and things like that. Now we get to maybe some of you on the call here, Gen 3, right? So you guys have, it's a much bigger group, and there may not be that closeness now in Gen 3 because you might be living in different cities. You might be from branches of different families that have grown separate. You're financially connected, but you don't have the relationships that Gen 1 had. And sometimes there can be, fights or between fractions of the family or within a family and things like that. But also in Gen 3, I think that, we tend to see that, them splinter, but the interest divulges. There's no longer the status quo and the widely accepted thought that we are a real estate-based family. And that's where problems can occur. The relationships are weak between the Gen 3s and the different arms of the family. The interest rates are divergent. And there's also less deference to Gen 1 and Gen 2. You don't know the family history is the same thing, right? And then the risk tolerance can be very, very different. And that's a big one because you could get some people in Gen 3 saying, hey, we want to go out there and set the world on fire. We want to be developers. We want to be entrepreneurs. We want to start a cryptocurrency, whatever. And then you might have other people saying, are you kidding me? I've got $50, $100 million, $25 million. I don't want to risk this. I'm not an entrepreneur, but your assets are tied together. And that's where it can lead to confusion, right? So we can also say that, so that's what can happen, but what can also happen is a successful transition. And that's what we hope for you and your family, right? So Gen 2 has been successful in transitioning from Gen 1 because there was that earned trust from Gen 1, okay? And there was that commitment of hard work, right? And Gen 2 may have been fully committed from day one. They may have stepped away for a period of time to get an education or maybe to raise a family, but they sort of got more education and they had probably more sophistication than Gen 1. Probably all of us had more sophistication because they got more education, had really better lives in Gen 1. But sometimes Gen 2 has been able to take the business to the next level. But boy, they never could have done it without Gen 1 building, that strong base, right? And so now when you get to Gen 3, is where the challenges occur because you need to have more governance and more management because you've gotten further away from the core asset. There's more people, who don't need each other. So what are the things that make for successful Gen 3 businesses? Number one is just the need for transparency with the shareholders. So there have to be regular meetings, full disclosure. You're running a business meeting. This isn't the family dinner. You know what I mean? This is a business meeting, right? You need to be flexible and you need to be adapt to everyone's needs because some people are going to need liquidity. Some people say, no, we just want our money and we want to go down this path. Others are going to want to say, we want to build a family business. Well, they're not willing to put their covenant on a construction loan, and you might be, right? So that's where the problems are going to occur. So many times, for the sake of the family and just for good business, okay, you need a division with the different economic interests in the family. Some want to invest, some want to commit time, some just want to commit money, some want to take risk, some want to just take dividends for the rest of their lives. And you all own several pieces of real estate that are not divisible. This is not like, one of my clients had a great line. He said, if my father had left us $100 million of Royal Bank shares, we wouldn't have had a fight, because I just could have taken my $25 million in shares and gone and sold them, kept them, whatever. But he didn't. He left them 10 apartment buildings and retail centers, which it was difficult to evaluate and things like that. We'll talk about that later on. So you need a fair compensation, and also there's also problems with people who work in the business getting salaries. Sometimes they're getting too little, sometimes they're getting too much, right? And then the other family members feel that, that's either unfair or fair, but someone's not happy with it, whether they pay too much or too little. Some of these things that I'm saying probably sound familiar to you if you are an intergenerational family, right? So Rod, next slide. So what can we do to, keep families moving forward and help them stay together? Well, if you ask most Gen 1 and Gen 2, the preference would be to find a way to keep the business together in Gen 1. And Gen 1 for sure, it's their business, it's their baby. And Gen 2 is often like that also, right? But, and they want to deal with the issue, they want to avoid a sale, a conflict, disastrous situations. Nobody wants a public embarrassment of a family fighting, and there have been some pretty bad examples of that have hit the press and things like that. So you need to find a way to achieve success. So how families stay together as you go from probably Gen 1 to 2 is easier, Gen 2 to Gen 3 is harder, is by putting proper governance in place. And oftentimes Gen 1, for a good reason that they just didn't even think of it, and they were so busy running the business, they didn't put good governance in place. So now it's your job as Gen 2 and Gen 3 to get everyone to agree to governance. And that's a problem by itself if the family isn't, fully connected. And because, the reason you're putting governance in place is to solve problems that are probably already occurring and that could occur, right? And oftentimes your families can't do this on their own. They need to engage third-party advisors. This is what we do. We go amongst families and try and work out what is the right, fair solution, and then put together the team of advisors. What we found is that if you get an estate lawyer, a tax lawyer, a trust lawyer, an accountant, an accounting specialist, everybody's operating in different silos. Everyone's just thinking about what they do. Someone has to step back, the advisor. Sometimes that's us. We've got to manage and put this whole thing together. And that's the art and the science of, of families. And then, you've got to create boards within the third parties, that can be helpful. Sometimes you might have external members on the board, sometimes internal family members on the board. Sometimes the board makeup is based on your percentage of ownership and things like that. And oftentimes, the grandfather is, well, most times is long gone and things like that, right? Okay, Rod, next slide. Families navigate changes for the family enterprise. There are going to be changes no matter what. And having good governance in place and having thought through things ahead of time will make things much smoother. And if you're in a family right now and you own assets like this, you really have to get everybody together to get on the same page, because whatever problems you're having now are probably going to get amplified in the future as there's another generation, as people change, as bad things are said in meetings that upset people, and then it becomes very, very emotional. So, we should create a process for family continuity, consensual options, objectives, and governance. Okay. So next slide. So managing the multi-party family transaction, right? So let's say you say to yourself, okay, we own this apartment building or a bunch of buildings like this, and you've got one building and 3 family members. Well, you can't cut the apartment building up in 3 the way you can divide Royal Bank shares. So you've got to decide on what you do here, right? And so if it's 2 out of 3 want to sell, then you're probably going to sell. But if 1 out of 3 going to sell, maybe the other 2 buy the other one up, right? But you need to sit through and go through the different, and it's never this simple, okay? It's more like that chart that I showed the first time. But you've got to decide on, what's the value of the building, and that could be a broker opinion of value. It could be 2 appraisers. You take the middle one. What if the appraisers are very far apart? You need a process to determine that, right? And what are the intensification opportunities? There's excess land on the property. Somebody would say, well, that has value. So the 2 of you are staying the deal and I'm getting out. You've got to pay me for that excess land that's there. How do you value that? It gets complicated. But if there were governance in place, or you relied on a third party to create a process for you, everybody agreed to it, you got the opinions, you valued it, and you had a process for the valuation, and that could lead to a sale, right? So to get the process started, you need, in the case of an apartment portfolio, which is typically what we deal with, appraisals, building condition reports, environmental reports, and then ultimately, what do you do that's that's fair, right? Okay, so separation agreements, right? It's inevitable. I think next slide, yeah. So it's inevitable at some point that somebody's going to want liquidity and somebody's not going to want liquidity. So preparing for it ahead of time will really save you a lot of grief, right? And if you can do this preparation, then you're going to save yourself that very expensive and nasty threat or actual litigation, and you don't want to go to litigation. Sometimes we've used litigation just to put pressure on the other people to come to the table and start talking about it, right? But you never want this thing to go to litigation within your family. That's certainly not what the previous generations that worked so hard and were so successful want from you. So I would say that dealing with lawyers is not a great outcome. Yes, sometimes you do have to go down that path to make people deal with things, but you should be trying to deal with it much earlier than that. Okay, and so if you're looking at a separation or some transactions, you need to know what your options are to liquidate and divide things up, and maybe that process can be run by a third party because there's so much charged energy here, negative energy sometimes if there's been problems. Some people might love the assets, and to some it's just a source of money, and you say, I want my money because I want to go do something else with it. Very valid comments on both sides, right? And then how do you subdivide an asset? Sometimes there are 10 assets and 3 children. Well, you don't just take 3 each and sell the 10 and sell the last one, right? You subdivide them and you rebalance with cash. Fair enough. And then how does the other side get the cash to buy the other one out? They've got to put mortgages on the building, and it just creates a lot of work, and a lot of things can go wrong. Sometimes you just want to sell. So sometimes you want to divide up the assets and rebalance with cash. Sometimes you just want to sell the entire asset. Sometimes, it doesn't happen too often, and it surprises me. You could sell to a REIT. Let's say a bunch of apartment buildings, sell them all to CapREIT or Boardwalk or kill them and take back shares, and then some people can stay and some people can go, and you've got ultimate liquidity. Get out whatever you want on any day. But most hard asset people tend not to like paper assets. They're hard asset people. They kind of want to go to cash or something else, but they tend not to take REIT shares. That surprises me. But you can. Then there's a whole bunch of paperwork has to get created for the division of the assets. If you stay together, some leave, some don't. You need professional help, right? Does everybody want to stay in? Great. Does everybody go to cash position? I think that's great. Does everyone want to divide up the assets? Great. It's when people have the difference of opinion amongst those 3 that that you have the problem, right? But we start off by saying keeping Gen 2 in just so the ideal thing is the longer you keep the assets in the family, the closer the family stays together, the more people that stay in the business, the better. And we think that's by creating positions for Gen 3 inside the company, fair positions being paid at market rate values, because otherwise the other families get upset, right? But also more than that, don't just assume Gen 3 wants to be in the business. Create things for Gen 3 who's never needed grocery money to be able to join the business and make the business better, not just continue it on in the way that it was running, right? Things have changed, right? So what's the message that we want to leave you with is that, well, we have solutions, we have ideas, We've done this many, many times. It's a boutique part of our business. I think you've already all got a white paper, which we wrote. I kind of wrote the white paper from my position. I think the next one I write will be from your position, that member of the intergenerational family. And I've heard people say surprising things to me. I've heard Gen 3 say they actually feel guilty. They said, we have all this wealth, we've never done anything to earn it. Well, it's yours, it's your bloodline, right? You shouldn't feel that way. But managing it prudently as a shepherd, of the asset is an important job that's landed on you, whether you wanted it or not, right? So we have interesting ideas, real experience doing this, and we wish you well in your family. And we think it's something that is, beautiful and worth protecting where you can. And this has come to everybody already. But if you can't be together, and oftentimes you can't be together because of the risk tolerance. Some want no risk and some want lots of risk, right? And some have no skill and some have lots of skill. And those two are going down a different path, and sometimes they need to separate. Now, I do say to families, when you do separate, it doesn't mean you're just monetizing your assets from buildings to money. You should be given the first opportunity in the friends and family round, or in the love money, right? The love round of that same family member, it's your cousin, your brother, sister, to invest in their deals. Now, you don't get the same return because the other guy's doing all the work, but you get to choose which deal to be in or not. And that's another way for everybody to get what they want. You divide up the assets, right? And the one that has the desire to grow and do, let's say, entrepreneurial real estate things, say, hey, cousin, hey, brother, sister, partner, children, I invite you into this deal early for a higher return because you're my partner, right? Because we may still own some common assets. Sometimes some assets are sold off and some are kept and things like that, right? So if there's a question, Rod, I'm happy to answer it. We've gone through a lot of things here. Pretty much everyone stayed with us. And we can, but reach out to us if you want to talk about it. We also, by the way, understand the importance of confidentiality, okay? We're going to, right off the bat, sign a CA agreement, but you need to know that we couldn't have gotten where we've gotten in this business without just talking to people honestly, candidly, and confidentially. Nobody wants to air a family problem in public. And generally, I would say that if you are having a family problem, it's a private matter. It doesn't help to talk about it outside the family, other than to advisors and things like that. So with that, we wish you well. 2023 was a tough
Hey, Derek,
year
we
for
do
a
have
lot
a
of
few
us.
questions. Derek, we do have a
Yeah,
few
okay.
questions that have
Okay.
cropped up.
All right,
Number
let's
one,
try it, Rob.
just in general for everybody, that the recording of this will be available. We'll put it in an email out to everybody. So sometime, probably by tomorrow, there will be this recording available. We had that question. But here's one question, Derek, for you. Are there any key differences in assets that are industrial instead of apartments? Anything that differentiates?
Yeah. And like people are asking anonymous questions, which is great because these are family matters, right? So I would say that industrial, let's think about just the amount of property management and asset management that there is, okay? Let's go from a high asset management to a low asset management, like the work. So industrial is probably the best one because you've just, rented out your whole industrial space to one guy, you just collect a check and maybe you cut the grass, right? And they probably pay taxes. The opposite would be a hotel or a retirement home, which are like in 100,000 square feet of industrial, you might need 0.25 of one employee to manage it per year or less, right? If you've got 100,000 square feet of a retirement home, you need 45 employees to run that same amount of space, right? So I would say that, the less management intensive the asset, which industrial is, okay, the easier it is to keep on an intergenerational basis. There aren't jobs to do. There's the industrial property and we'll replace the roof every 25 years or we need to do. Apartments are more management intensive, but it's not like owning a hotel or retirement home. And it's also more legislative. You know what I mean? You got 100 customers or 200 customers living in 100,000 square feet. In an industrial building, you just got one, right? In a hotel, you've got all kinds of other things, right, Rod?
Yep. And then we have a question from a Gen 2.
So there are some differences, and I would say
go ahead.
Well, look, this is a difficult um process, right? How do you encourage Gen 1 to let go? Yeah, big problem. Okay. Because what happens is Gen 1, and probably no Gen 1's on the call, okay? Gen 1's life is this business. They work 7 days a week, okay? They turn 65 and they had a 25-year vision, okay, to bring them to 90. They come in the office every day still. They second guess decisions, right? I think really good question to ask, and I don't think that I have a great answer to it. But I've noticed, and a lot of times I wind up at the family's home, the mother has a different opinion than the father. Okay? Here's a real subtle point I'm making. The mother, don't get all gender on me, Derek, blah, blah, blah. But let's just assume that the father started the business, the mother stayed home and raised the children, okay? It can be the other way, but it typically happens. So, the mother's thinking about the children's relationship first, okay? The father's thinking about the success of the business. You see my point, Rob? Right?
Absolutely.
And sometimes the mother has a different view of things and will say to the father, for family unity. And he said, no, but what about cash flow? Right? And so sometimes that can come from an outside person. There are family psychologists. Think of the guy's name, John Golubnik. Just met him once very briefly. Not a psychologist, but he's kind of a psychologist. Another a woman in New York. We asked her once to come on our event. Kind of a European name, Marta someone. And she was a psychologist who just dealt with families. Fair enough? And I agree with you. Sometimes Gen 1 needs to let go, because what I've seen happen is if Gen 1 is at the reins till they're 85 years old or 88 years old, Gen 2 is 60 and they haven't made a decision yet. And then all of a sudden Gen 1 dies, now you throw Gen 2 into it. So explain to Gen 1 that you want this business to continue. It's your love, it's a child for you, right? You've got to start letting go of this. And the smartest guys I've seen was sitting on the meetings, not that they let the kids talk. They let the kids make decisions. The kids have to make mistakes, right? And the kids are going to understand the internet. They're going to understand facts. I mean, I just remember how these dads would hold on, and the offices were terrible. They didn't have a fax machine, and I'm going back a long time now. They didn't have a, what's that web page thing, right? And now it'll be what's that AI thing? But the next generation gets it. Yep. How do you let go of Gen 1? Well, it's a really, really good question. It's probably the mom, the psychologist, other people, or maybe show other people in the business who made the transition to the next generation. And there are organizations out there, a bunch of them, that help families go from one to another. But if Gen 1 is cantankerous and stubborn and says, I built this business, I'm running it the way I want to run it, they're probably going to run it the way they want to run it, right? And you just think about, if you're Gen 2, think about the consequences of when they do have to give up the business, and maybe start thinking about that now. Really good question. Really good question.
All right, I don't have any other questions.
Anything else, or is that it? I think we pretty much. Yeah, no. Well, first, listen, thank you all for joining us, and we wish you the best for 2024. Okay? Cheerio.